Hi, welcome back to Protein Purification Techniques in Biochemistry. My name is Kevin Tokoph. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for future videos and notifications. Alright, so in this video we're going to do an exam caliber question, and this is going to be a protein purification problem. Alright, so here in this table right here we have some information. We have the names of several proteins, 6 of them to be exact. Also the oligomeric state of the protein is given. In this case, LAAO is a dimer, meaning it has 2 subunits. We have a tetramer, monomer, and so forth. Also, the molecular weight of each protein, the full molecular weight is given of each subunit. And then also the molecular weight of the total protein when you combine all the subunits, so the native state molecular weight's given. And then also the PI, or the isoelectric point. And the type of protein purification problem we're looking at is a separation problem. Okay, so we're going to jump right into these questions down here and come up to this one at the end. All right, you subject the proteins in the table above to anion exchange chromatography. What would be the order of elution? All right, so in a problem like this, one of the important things is when you're given some kind of chromatographic technique, what do you need to know? All right, so several things. We have several classes of PIs that we can have. So if I have a high PI, a high isoelectric point. In general, what this means is that the protein overall is going to be more positively charged. Okay, it's not to say there couldn't be some negatives, but remember there's hundreds of amino acid residues, a lot of which are charged. If the isoelectric point is high, and usually we mean that the isoelectric point is greater than 7, then the protein overall is going to be more positively charged. If we have a low isoelectric point, that usually indicates that overall the protein is more negatively charged. And that's usually what we say is a PI less than 7. Okay? High isoelectric point proteins tend to be positively charged. They contain things, a lot of usually lysine and arginine residues. And low isoelectric points contain usually carboxyl amino acids like glutamate or aspartate. Okay? So we have this fact right here. So you can see the various isoelectric points. We have 2 that are over 7 and the rest are below 7. We're subjecting this to anion exchange chromatography. So what does that mean? Well, if we look at an anion exchange column, okay, the column itself, the resin in the column, is going to have positive charge. And that might not make a lot of sense at first because you say it's anion exchange. Well, when you name a type of ion exchange chromatography, so anion exchange, that means that the column likes to bind anionic proteins, meaning negatively charged proteins. So how could a column bind an anion or bind a negatively charged protein? Well, it would have to have a positive resin so that the negatively charged proteins could stick on there. And this is going to be the basis of anion exchange. If we had cation exchange chromatography, the resin would be negatively charged, and cation exchange binds cationic proteins. Okay, so when you say anion exchange, that gives it away that it's binding anionic proteins. The only way it can do that is if it has a positively charged resin. So if I have any negatively charged proteins here, they're going to theoretically stick strongly in the resin. And if I have positively charged proteins, they're going to elute first. Okay, so how do I know if a protein's positive or negative? Well, high isoelectric points are positive, okay, and low isoelectric points are negative. Well, the ones that are going to elute first are going to be the positive because they're repelled by the resin and they're going to go through. So the first, I'm going to say the first are going to be over on this side, and these are going to be the last over here. So the first ones to elute in anion exchange chromatography are going to be the positively charged ones. And high isoelectric point are the ones that are positive. So the highest isoelectric point is 9. So the first to elute is going to be RAS. The next highest is 7.5 or ADHD. The next one, let's see, 7.5, we have 2 that are 6. So we're going to say L-amino acid oxidase is going to be tied with rubisco. What's after that? Well, I have a 5.5, that's sortase. And then the lowest isoelectric point, the one that's the most negative and will stick easiest on this resin, is going to be formate dehydrogenase, FDH. And so this is going to be the order of elution, assuming it's anion exchange chromatography. The nice thing is if the question was changed to cation exchange, you would just flip this order. In that case, FDH would be the first to elute, and the last to elute would be RAS. Okay, so that's how you kind of go about determining orders of elution. So when you have anion exchange chromatography, a good thing to know would be the isoelectric points and those trends. Okay, let's go to the next question. So notice what we said here is we have two proteins that elute together using anion exchange. They would actually elute together if you did cation exchange too. But those are LAAO and Rubisco. And the reason they elute together is both of their isoelectric points are 6. Okay, they're both the same. So they don't actually separate using ion exchange. You're going to have to use another technique to separate them. So these elute together into the same fraction. How could you separate those proteins further? Well, given the information we have, we only have really two pieces of information that would be useful in some way. Okay, we have the oligomeric state, but what's going to be most useful is the native state molecular weight. Notice that the molecular weight of Rubisco is 32,000 grams per mole, or Daltons, but the molecular weight of L-amino acid oxidase is 60,000 Daltons. Okay, so notice that L-amino acid oxidase and Rubisco have different molecular weights, so a technique that you could use to separate these in their native state would be size exclusion chromatography. And if you were to determine which one of those elutes first, the heavier one elutes first through size exclusion. The heavier one of those two is L-amino acid oxidase. So the first to elute would be L-amino acid oxidase. The last to elute would be Rubisco in between those two, just because Rubisco is smaller, so it is going to elute last. Okay, in size exclusion chromatography, the largest one is always first. Okay, here's another question. Suppose you wanted to achieve sufficient separation, but you had no access to a size exclusion column for whatever reason. So in other words, we could still do anion exchange if we wanted to, but we don't have the size exclusion, so we can't really separate these based on molecular weight. What technique could you use, and why would this work? All right, so we still have all these PI values. We have molecular weight, and I'm going to think maybe I'd like to do this in the easiest number of steps, the least number of steps. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to do something called 2D isoelectric focusing. That's the technique I'm going to use if I have access to it, if I don't have a size exclusion column. So how does that work? Well, the way it kind of works is, let me kind of draw a diagram, and we talked about this in another video, so I'm just going to sort of breeze through it. But you have essentially a gradient, some kind of gradient going ultimately left to right, it could be, and maybe you have low pH over here, maybe you have high pH over there. Not PI, it's pH. Okay, so because as you go left to right, there's differences in pH, it's in other words a pH gradient. Going left to right, proteins will separate based on their isoelectric point. Okay, and since most of these have different ones, they will separate. However, the problem you have if you do 1D isoelectric focusing is LAAO and Rubisco will not separate like we saw before. But what I can also do is going in the downwards direction, if I look at it this way, if I go in this direction like this, I can actually run an SDS page in this direction. Okay? So, in other words, left to right, because of the pH gradient, left to right they'll separate based on isoelectric point, but if going downwards, they'll migrate based on their molecular sizes. Okay, so if I'm looking specifically at LAAO and Rubisco, which have the exact same isoelectric points, they'll actually be in the same, one will be on top of each other, because they're not going to be left or right of each other because they have the same isoelectric point. But what you would see is in other words, Rubisco, I believe, was the smaller one. So Rubisco is going to migrate further. Maybe it's right there. So that's Rubisco. But the other one, L-amino acid oxidase, which is larger, will be up here. And notice they're directly vertical with respect to each other. They're not left or right of each other because they have the same isoelectric point. Okay? If one of them had a different isoelectric point, they would be left or right with respect to each other, but they're not. They're right on top of each other because they have the same isoelectric point, but one of them migrates further because their molecular weights are different. And so this ultimately achieves separation of those two proteins. And this would be something you could do in one step. Okay? So we have one more question here. Suppose you had the same list of proteins in the table, but another monomeric protein was added called XDH, made up. XDH has a molecular weight of 80,000 and a pi of 9. Okay? There's something in this table that already has a pH, or excuse me, a molecular weight of 80,000 and it has a pi of 9. How could you achieve separation of XDH from all other proteins? Well, can you use 2D isoelectric focusing? No. Can you use size exclusion? No. It's also monomeric, so you can't use any kind of denaturing to do it because it won't denature any further. You can't break any subunits apart because there's only one. Has same molecular weight, so the first kind of chromatography that would come to my mind that you could use is affinity chromatography. Okay, you're going to assume that RAS right here, RAS has some substrate or something that it binds. In fact, it does. The thing that it binds is guanosine triphosphate. And assuming XDH does not bind GTP and it binds something else, I don't know what it binds, but it's going to bind something else that's not GTP, then you can use the specificity of RAS and the specificity of XDH to separate those. And in fact, one of the things is because proteins are so specific, affinity chromatography tends to be one of the most powerful that you can use. And it's often one of the last separation techniques you do, and it's oftentimes when you construct a purification table, the step where you use affinity chromatography, the purity of the protein increases the most, or that's at least one of the tendencies. All right, so hopefully this video made sense. You got to hopefully step through a few kind of questions that are, I would say, exam level or exam caliber. All right, so make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel for future videos and notifications, and we're going to do some more lab technique problems in future videos. Thank you for watching.